Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video. And today's topic is going to be huge selling albums that failed to become legendary. Now, the inspiration for this video came about last night. I was streaming the album Invisible Touch by Genesis, which I hadn't heard for many years. The version I was listening to is the one which is on Spotify, which is the 2007 remix, which actually sounds quite good. They've stripped away some of that 80s reverb and clatter. It's still a bit like that, but it's kind of better. You know, this was an album that was massive for me. Back when I was in my student days, in my early 20s, it was the first Genesis album I ever heard. And, you know, it did make me a fan. And I still like it. I still think it's got some good songs on it. I don't think it was a complete sellout like some people say it was. But it got me thinking about, you know, these albums that just sold squillions of copies back in the day, and yet despite that, they haven't achieved that status of your, you know, Dark Side of the Moons and Wish You Were Here's and Rumours, you know, all these records which have gone down in history now as being big sellers, but also they've ended up in the history books as these great influential albums that everybody still loves and everybody must own in their collections. And interestingly, there are also albums which fall into that category which did not sell well at all back in the day. So, you know, take the first Big Star album, which sold diddly squat. That now is always in these lists of, you know, great albums to hear before you die. So big sales were not necessarily always the be-all and end-all. You can have an album which sold a lot and became legendary. You can have an album that sold not very much and became legendary. But then you've also got these albums that sold a lot and did not become legendary, and we're going to look at a few of them today. Most of them come from the 1980s, interestingly. Make of that what you want, but a couple of them come from the 1970s, and we'll start with them. I've got quite a few notes here which I'm going to go through. I'm going to just discuss chart positions and whether things became platinum or gold or, you know, whatever, and then we'll have a quick chat about each one as to why we think it didn't become legendary. So we're going to begin in the year 1976. It's the first one I've got for you. I think it's 1976. And this is a record which anybody who digs for records, either here in the UK or in the US, will be extremely familiar with. It's this one. It's Endless Flight by Leo Sayer. Now, we had this album in my house when I was growing up. This is the copy that my dad bought for my mother. It's because she loved the tracks You Make Me Feel Like Dancing and When I Need You, both consecutive #1 hits around the world, absolutely massive. And let's just do the stats quickly for this one. Endless Flight, his fourth album. Only got to #4 in the UK, to be fair, #10 in the US, so it didn't go #1, but it was platinum in both the UK and the US, double platinum in Canada. So it was a huge selling record. Nowadays, you find them in charity shops, multiple copies sometimes, you know, in these cardboard boxes that you rifle through on the floor. 25p, just nobody wants this record. It's just one of those ones which is just passed into non-legend, permanent non-regard. And yet at the time, it was massive. This next one, an album which always gets knocked, always gets slagged off, Wings, At the Speed of Sound. This one again, actually, from 1976. This was the album where Paul decided to give some, to sort of share the credit around, really, gave every band member a song to sing. And again, this is a charity shop record. I see people slanging it off all the time on YouTube. It gets very little love despite having been absolutely huge. #1 in America. It was their fifth album, 1976, topped the charts in the US, got to #2 in the UK. Both the singles reached #5 in the UK and the US. And Silly Love Songs actually got to #1 in the US, went gold in the UK and platinum in the US. So there is an album. I don't know how it compares to Band on the Run. You know, that album, I guess, is the one that everybody says is legendary now. Even Venus and Mars, the one after that sold tons, you know, and that one also now is kind of not really that well regarded outside the fan base. Is it not a very good record? I mean, that is just so subjective. I guess it fell just before the punk movement broke, and it's quite a soft album. It's quite middle of the road in places. You know, I can see why the punks didn't like it. I read an interview years ago with Manny from the Stone Roses, and he was talking about what music was like just before punk broke, and this was the album that he highlighted as you know, saying this is why music had to change. This is why things had to be shaken up. I think he bought the album on cassette, and he just thought it was terrible. I love it, obviously, being a big Wings fan, but yeah, huge seller, not legendary. Couldn't do this video without talking about ELO, so we're moving to 1978 now. This is the album they made after the huge blockbuster that was Out of the Blue. Now, whether that album is now legendary, that's a moot point. I think ELO have risen in the critical canon a little bit over recent years. I think thanks to Jeff Lynne relaunching the band and having this huge success with this comeback version of the band, which is now touring America at the moment, doing a farewell tour. But for a while, ELO were critical rock bottom, really, you know, in the 1980s, and then moving into the 90s, you could find their records, you know, they were just 2 to a penny. Out of the Blue now, I think now has a bit more of a cash to it. I think some people do sort of see that as being a legendary album. This one, the follow-up, Discovery, the clues in the title. Jeff Lynne started to flirt with some disco elements on this record, and it, you know, did result in massive hit singles and huge sales, but now the album, it's not particularly well regarded. Again, it's a charity shop staple. It was their 8th album, got to number 1 in the UK, went platinum, got to number 5 in the US, went twice platinum. Australia got to number 1, Canada got to number 3, went gold in Germany and France, and platinum in New Zealand. And all the singles were massive hits all over the world, no pun intended. So yeah, that definitely fits the bill, I think. A record that does not have any kind of legendary qualities, and yet it was enormous. Right, this next one, an artist who I'm not that into him, but I do like a couple of things he's done. And this is the only album that I have by him, actually, and I thought I would include it. This is the Canadian singer-songwriter Bryan Adams and his album Reckless. Now, I don't think this was his biggest selling album. That might have been the one that came after. I think that was Waking Up the Neighbours, wasn't it? The Mutt Lange one. This one, Reckless, is the album that contains the hit songs Summer of '69, I think, is on here, and Run to You, which were both huge hits back in the day, massive songs back in the late 80s. His 4th album, 1984, 12 million copies worldwide, got to number 1 in the US, got to number 7 in the UK. The first Canadian album ever to sell 1 million copies, and it went 11 times platinum in Canada alone. A massive seller, and you know, why are Bryan Adams' albums not legendary? I guess because I think he sort of tainted himself a little bit when he did the Robin Hood song. What was it called? Everything I Do It For You. In the UK anyway, that was number 1 for months, and it just drove everybody nuts. And I think Bryan, he sort of lost whatever edge he had, if he ever had any edge. You know, he started doing duets with Mel C from the Spice Girls, and he just became, I don't know, he just became a bit bland, I suppose. And his stuff now, I suppose, it's seen as being dated. I think that's the problem. As you get into the 80s, these albums, they've got a bit of a dated 80s sound to them. It's very hard to be legendary and timeless when you have that kind of 80s sheen to your music. And this next one is a great example of that. A huge band who were still huge at this point, at least in the UK. They'd made a couple of albums, which I think, well, at least one album, which definitely always ends up in the legendary canon. But by this point, Queen were definitely not seen as being legendary, but they were still selling an awful lot of records. This is a kind of magic. At this point, the band had flopped in the US, largely thanks, I think, to Freddie's moustache, and you know, some of the musical directions that they were going down at this point went really currying favour in the American sort of rock market. But they were still doing big guns. This is the album, of course, that launched the Live Magic tour, which was absolutely huge. Came off the back of their Live Aid performance, and just saw them playing absolutely huge venues across Europe. They played South America, you know, absolutely huge success. In terms of this particular record, you might be surprised to learn how successful it was. It got to number 1 in the UK, sold 100,000 copies in the first week. It stayed in the UK charts for 63 weeks and spawned 4 hit singles, and it went top 5 in many other territories. Didn't do too well in the US, like I said. Queen at this point in North America had sort of flopped a little bit, but they were huge in South America, still huge in Japan. This album was massive, and I think the perception at the time still was that they were riding on a commercial high, and it's sort of, in a way, it's a peak for them, because this is the last album they toured with. After that, Freddie Mercury became ill, but not a legendary album. And I think at this point you can say there are some albums that sell big because of just circumstance, the way that the band or the artist were kind of being marketed at the time, where they were in their career curve, were they on the way up, were they on the way down. And so you get these albums that slip through the net, which are not great albums, and I think this would definitely fall into that category. I really like it because I'm a huge Queen fan, but objectively, this is not vintage Queen. And I think you could say the same thing for a few records in this in this pile. This one too, probably. This is the one that everybody was probably shouting as soon as they saw the thumbnail for the video. This is the big obvious one. Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. Now, the stats for this one are quite extraordinary. Their 5th album came out in 1985, 14 consecutive weeks at number 1 on the UK album charts, 30 million copies sold worldwide, 9 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Top 200, 10 times platinum in the UK, 9 times platinum in the US. But honestly, who wants to hear this album again? I hardly ever listen to it. I quite like some of the tracks, but Walk of Life, that keyboard part in Walk of Life, it's so dated. It was so overplayed at the time as well. Maybe that's another factor that comes into play. These albums that were so huge, people just got sick of them. They got absolutely tired of hearing some of this stuff. And for some reason that didn't happen with some of those other albums. I mean, Rumours is an album which, the singles from that album are hugely overplayed as well, but for some reason people don't get sick of it. But Dire Straits, Brothers in Arms, I think, is definitely an album which outstayed its welcome on the radio, and just, they were just everywhere, weren't they? Absolutely everywhere. And their career nosedived quite sharply after this record. So this was the huge commercial breakthrough, I suppose. And again, very, very 1980s. It has a certain sheen to it. And we'll finish with this one. Again, not a band that I love. I quite like the first album. This is the only other record by them that I've got, because to me it's just, maybe this album is legendary, actually. Maybe it is. I'm not entirely sure. I do think it's quite a good album. This is Def Leppard and Hysteria. Now, this one came out, let's have a look. This one is, it was their 4th album, 1987, number 1 in the US and the UK. 20 or 28 million copies worldwide, 12 million in the US, 7 hit singles, and it's one of the best-selling albums of all time. This is just a band, I think, who just, they found themselves in this position really briefly for being the biggest band in the world, I think, when they, they were doing a big, huge tour at the time, and they were absolutely massive. They headlined the Monsters of Rock Festival at Castle Donington. The singles were everywhere. The Mutt Lange production, I think, had a lot to do with it. I think he was a sort of, flavour of the month producer at the time, and his sound now has become quite dated. Not badly dated. I mean, he did Back in Black by AC/DC as well. Now, there's an album, Back in Black, absolutely huge seller, but of course, totally legendary. Nobody would argue with that. Is Hysteria by Def Leppard legendary? There'll be some Def Leppard fans watching who will go, yeah, absolutely it is. It's definitely an 80s, legendary 80s album. Other people will just look at it and go, no. And I think that's the key to it, really. I think to be a truly legendary album, you've got to have universal agreement, even from the people who don't like the record. People who don't like Pink Floyd, they don't like Fleetwood Mac. They will still say, yeah, but Rumours is clearly a legendary album. Dark Side of the Moon is a legendary album. But those people will not say that about Def Leppard Hysteria. They'll go, oh God, no, I hate Def Leppard. So yeah, I'm not slagging it off. I think, it's got some really good songs on it. I really like Armageddon It, actually, is my favourite Def Leppard song. They were a good band, and they were, I think they got really lucky, actually, and they became really, really massive. At just the right time, that sort of hair metal era in the 80s. Anyway, there are other examples. There are a few others I could think of, but I thought I would spare you those. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that topic. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, whether you can think of any other examples or, share your thoughts about those records that I showed. I hope I didn't offend anybody. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.